The day he decided to bend time began like any other. Cold coffee in a cracked mug, his eyes clouded by sleepless nights and that low hum from the lab, servers breathing fans spinning the continuous sound of a clock that no longer needed to mark anything. He had lost everything at once, the project that was his life, the family that was his haven, and in the same sequence, the certainty that the future would be predictable. It was this loss that pushed him to risk the impossible. Building the time machine was not an act of arrogance, it was an act of meticulous desperation. Every wire, every piece of code, every proof was an attempt to reclaim what fate had taken from him. He knew the theories, the paradoxes, the infinite branches, but he equally knew the empty space where laughter once resided. And when the machine finally whirred and the lights spun in an electrical dance, the feeling was less of triumph and more of a return to the point that, in his memory, he could still fix. The first trip was small, just going back a few hours, moving a word out of place, preventing an argument from reaching a door. In the beginning, the change seemed almost magical. One detail corrected, and the universe gave him back a path that felt right. He returned to the present and found minor differences, a displaced painting, a less dry plant, and for a fleeting moment, he felt he had succeeded. The memory of a lost embrace trembled and drew near, but the world, as if it had a memory of its own, began to respond. The consequences were not immediate. They didn't manifest as a sudden storm. They were subtle, a call that didn't happen, an avoided accident that created another, a smile that wasn't given that left a rumor of solitude. Each alteration in the past caused echoes that folded and rebounded in unforeseen directions. He learned, in the most brutal way, that time was not a straight line as he had imagined. It was a complex fabric where pulling one thread tightened knots that loosened elsewhere. Days of experiments turned into nights of vigil. He tried to fix the first fix. He went back to erase a mistake that had created another minor catastrophe. He went back again in increasingly risky rotations, trying to adjust the collision of possibilities. And with each return, the reality that awaited him in the present transformed. People changed jobs. Cities displayed new scars. Old news gave way to headlines that seemed like strange translations of a world he once knew. This began to cost him more than just memories. The burden of choosing. With each intervention, he became the judge and executioner of others' stories. In an attempt to save one life, he redirected the fate of another. By erasing a disease, he allowed someone to encounter another suffering. The core issue ceased to be technical and became moral. Who was he to decide which futures deserved to exist? For which version of happiness was it worth sacrificing another? Science by itself offered technical answers, probabilities, branching diagrams, simulations. But when real life entered the equation, statistics were no longer enough. There was one night when he went back to prevent an accident from killing a man who, in another version of time, had saved 2 children. Saving that man at that point would mean 2 other people would die at another temporal knot. The calculation, no matter how exact, did not lessen the burden of remorse. As the attempts progressed, strange side effects began to emerge, not just in the external world, but in his mind. Old recollections mingled with memories of the lives he had erased and recreated. He dreamed of people he had never met in his original timeline, and on other nights saw flashes of futures that could have been. It was as if his mind, having traveled so many times, had been stitched together from multiple lives, each with its own emotional grammar. It became difficult to distinguish between what he actually remembered and what had been borrowed by his own manipulations. The machine also seemed to have a physical cost. Each little jump in time left a trace, a sharp headache, a metallic taste in his mouth, an extra strand of hair, a different scar on his arm. It was almost symbolic. The body refused to be a clean slate, and the past refused to be touched without leaving marks. But nothing hurt as much as realizing that time offered no guarantees. It merely exchanged problems for new problems, moving the pieces on different boards. In a moment of spite, he didn't want to admit, he tried to erase his own first journey. He thought that if he reset everything before his initial move, he could restore the original course. It was a hesitant gesture, fraught with hope. When he returned, the world was back to how it was before. Yet, the absence was not a relief, it was a deeper void. Because, despite everything, the journey that led him to build the machine had also brought lessons, regrets that defined him. Without those experiences, without the pain that shaped him, he found himself strangely lost. The paradox of fixing had become clear. Fixing meant also erasing the parts of himself that learned from the mistake. The voices around him, criticism, warnings, colleagues' advice, became noise. He isolated himself in the cold bubble of the lab, with insomnia as his only companion. Sometimes the phone rang, and when he answered, he heard voices vaguely resembling his father's, his wife's. Other times, nothing. Each ring was a reckoning with time. He developed a ritual. Before any trip, he left a recorded message, strict instructions for himself and a warning to any future or past that might intercept him. "Don't interfere with what brings you peace," said one note. Then, "Don't try to save everyone," said another. But the paradox of choice was precisely this. The more he knew the effects, the harder it became to keep his hands still. That point arrived where the alterations became so complex that the temporal system itself began to respond in unsettling ways. Small physical phenomena started to occur. Clocks turning backward for seconds, shadows not following the light, people who, upon crossing him, apologized for things he hadn't done. There was a growing sensation that the fabric of time was worn, and that, if he kept pulling, it might tear. It was then that ethics imposed itself with a sharp clarity. He realized that the dilemma was not just technical, but deeply human. The decision to alter a past was equivalent to writing someone's history without their consent. If only there had been a universal moral clause that determined when to intervene, but the universe did not come with a regulation. Thus, the only law he found was the one he himself could live without breaking. To choose in a way that the changes preserved the dignity of the lives, affected even when it meant keeping pain as part of the human fabric. The last trip he decided to take was not to save someone. It was to understand. He walked to the moment he considered most sacred in his memory, not to touch but to observe. He saw his younger self, laughing at something silly, and for a second he was able to feel the joy he had lost. And then, silently, he let time move on. He returned to the present with the same cracked mug, but with something different, an acceptance that was not resignation. It was a recognition that every choice, every loss, had contributed to who he was, and that trying to erase the pain would also be erasing the possibility of learning. When he turned off the machine for the last time, it wasn't for lack of temptation. It was a conscious choice. He left behind a set of recordings with instructions and warnings, a testimony from a man who traveled too much and learned the price of manipulating others' lives. He didn't destroy the machine. He merely covered it, like someone storing an instrument that can wound as much as it can heal. And in the nights that followed, when a strange noise recalled the engines that once spun, he didn't feel the impulse to go back. He only felt a copy of a memory, which sometimes turned into a song. The lesson that time, however many doors it offers us, does not give us authority over others' paths. The world went on, with its small flaws and great beauty. Sometimes, by chance, he walked past a street and saw a scene that made him smile. A father playing with his daughter, a musician playing on a corner, two people arguing and then reconciling. These images were, for him, living proof that not all pain needed to be erased for the universe to be merciful. There was a kind of order in the consequences, an order that did not depend on perfection, but on the continuity of stories. In the end, the paradox of choice remained without mathematical resolution, but with a clear moral truth. Life is a tapestry of mistakes and mends, and the temptation to rewrite the thread is always great. But what makes us human is perhaps precisely the courage to live with the crooked lines we draw. He learned that there are moments when fixing is human, and others when, paradoxically, the most human thing is to accept. And so, between cold coffees and clocks that insist on marking time, he ceased to be the man who tried to fix the world. He finally became someone who learned to take care of the present, because it is in the present that the true choices still happen.